The wind howled through the canyon like a banshee's wail as Julie Diaz pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her swollen belly making every movement a struggle. Snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that melted instantly on her fever-flushed cheeks. She had been walking for 3 days now, surviving on nothing but melted snow and the few dried berries she had found clinging to withered bushes. Her husband's voice echoed in her memory, promising he would return from the mining camp with enough gold to start their new life. That was 6 weeks ago. Get on my horse now. The mountain man's voice cut through the storm like a blade. Matthew Jones stood before her, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray sky, one weathered hand extended toward her, while the other held the reins of a sturdy bay mare. His eyes, steel blue and uncompromising, held no room for argument. The snow is getting worse and you will not survive the night out here. Julie's legs gave out beneath her as she tried to stand, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion and hunger that had been her constant companions. The baby kicked weakly inside her, as if sensing the danger they were both in. She looked up at this stranger who had appeared like some guardian spirit from the wilderness, his long dark hair streaked with silver, his face carved by years of mountain living, into something both fierce and strangely gentle. "I cannot pay you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I have nothing left to give." Matthew's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he studied her face, taking in the hollow cheeks and the desperate courage that still flickered in her dark eyes. "Payment was not what I was asking for," he replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. He dismounted and approached her slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "When did you last eat something that was not snow or bark?" The question hit her like a physical blow, reminding her of just how far she had fallen from the comfortable life she had once known. 3 days ago, she managed, though it felt like a lifetime, maybe 4. The days blur together when you are walking toward nothing but empty horizon. Matthew nodded grimly and pulled a piece of dried meat from his saddlebag, pressing it into her trembling hands. "Eat this slowly," he instructed. "Too much too fast will make you sick, and we have a long ride ahead of us." His fingers were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had carved his survival from an unforgiving landscape. Yet they were surprisingly gentle as they steadied her shaking ones. As Julie forced herself to chew the tough meat slowly, she studied her unlikely rescuer. He was older than her by perhaps 15 years, his face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the granite cliffs that surrounded them. There was something in his manner that spoke of long solitude, of a man who had grown accustomed to his own company and found most others lacking. Yet here he was, offering help to a stranger without question or condition. "Where are you taking me?" she asked between careful bites, surprised by the steadiness that was already returning to her voice. The food was working its magic, sending warmth through her starved body like liquid fire. "My cabin is about 8 miles north of here," Matthew replied, checking the storm clouds that were gathering overhead with obvious concern. "It is not much, but it is warm and dry, and there is food enough for both of us until this weather passes." He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "After that, we can figure out what comes next." The simple kindness in his words nearly broke her. For weeks, she had been alone with her fear and her growing despair, watching her body change as the baby grew while her husband remained absent and her resources dwindled to nothing. She had begun to believe that she would die out here in this vast wilderness, that her child would never draw its first breath. Now this stranger was offering her not just survival, but time to plan, to hope again. "I do not even know your name," she said, accepting his hand as he helped her to her feet. The world swayed slightly, but his grip was steady and sure. "Matthew Jones," he replied simply. "And you are Julie, unless I am much mistaken. Your husband spoke of you often when he was buying supplies in town." The words hit her like cold water. "You knew Thomas," she breathed, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Do you know where he is? Why he has not returned?" Matthew's face grew grim, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that made her stomach clench with dread. "We will talk of such things when you are stronger," he said carefully. "Right now, what matters is getting you somewhere safe and warm. The storm is worsening, and we need to move. He helped her mount his horse, his hands respectful but firm as he ensured she was secure in the saddle. The mare was well trained and steady, sensing perhaps that her rider was fragile and in need of gentle treatment. Matthew swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring as he gathered the reins and urged the horse forward into the swirling snow. The ride to his cabin passed in a blur of white and cold, the horse picking its way carefully along paths that only Matthew seemed able to see. Julie found herself leaning back against his chest, drawing warmth from his body as the storm raged around them. She could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, responding perhaps to her own tension and the horse's rhythmic gait. "Tell me about yourself," Matthew said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "It will help pass the time and keep your mind off the cold." "There is not much to tell," Julie replied, though she found comfort in the sound of his voice cutting through the wind. "I was a teacher back in Missouri before I married Thomas. We came west because he heard there was gold in these mountains, enough to make us rich." She laughed bitterly. "I should have known better than to trust in such dreams." "Dreams are not always foolish," Matthew observed. "Sometimes they are the only things that keep us moving forward when everything else falls apart. But a man should not chase his dreams at the expense of those who depend on him." The criticism of her husband was gentle but unmistakable, and Julie felt a strange mixture of loyalty and agreement. Thomas had always been a dreamer, full of grand plans and schemes that never quite worked out as he imagined. She had loved that about him once, his eternal optimism and his belief that something better was always just around the corner. But now, carrying his child and abandoned in a wilderness that cared nothing for dreams or hopes, she wondered if his optimism had been less admirable than she had once thought. "What about you?" she asked, wanting to turn the conversation away from her own troubles. "How long have you lived up here alone?" "7 years," Matthew replied, and she could hear something in his voice that spoke of old pain carefully buried. "I came here after the war, looking for peace and quiet. Found both, along with a few other things I had not been looking for." "Such as what?" Julie pressed gently, sensing that he was a man who rarely spoke of himself. "Such as the knowledge that a man can survive almost anything if he has to," Matthew said after a long pause. "And that sometimes the things we run away from follow us no matter how far we go." Before Julie could ask what he meant, the outline of a cabin appeared through the swirling snow, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that seemed like a beacon of hope in the storm. It was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke rose straight up into the still air of the sheltered valley. Matthew helped her down from the horse and guided her quickly to the door, supporting her weight as her legs threatened to give out again. Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable, with a large stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on walls, lined with books and simple but well-made furniture. The smell of wood smoke and something savory cooking filled the air, making her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Sit by the fire," Matthew instructed, settling her into a chair close to the hearth. "I will tend to the horse, and then we will get some proper food into you." As he disappeared back into the storm, Julie looked around the cabin with growing amazement. This was not the rough shelter she had expected, but a real home, complete with curtains at the windows and rugs on the floor. Books lined makeshift shelves along one wall, their spines worn with frequent handling. A pot hung over the fire, filling the room with the rich aroma of stew that made her mouth water. When Matthew returned, stamping snow from his boots and shaking it from his hair, he found her staring into the flames with tears streaming down her cheeks. He said nothing, simply ladled stew into a bowl and pressed it into her hands along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat slowly," he reminded her again, settling into the chair across from her. "You have time now. There is no need to rush." The stew was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, rich with meat and vegetables that spoke of careful preparation and abundant stores. As she ate, she felt strength flowing back into her body, along with something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. "This is wonderful," she said between spoonfuls. "You are a good cook." "A man learns many things when he lives alone," Matthew replied with a slight smile. "Cooking is one of the more useful skills." "You said you knew my husband," Julie said carefully, setting down her spoon. The question had been burning in her mind since he first mentioned Thomas's name. Can you tell me what happened to him? Matthew's face grew serious, and he was quiet for so long that she began to fear the worst. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Thomas was killed in a mine collapse 3 weeks ago, along with 2 other men. I am sorry, Julie. I had hoped someone would have gotten word to you by now. The bowl slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the stone hearth as the words hit her like physical blows. She had known somewhere deep inside that something terrible had happened. A man did not simply disappear for weeks without word unless something had gone very wrong. But knowing and hearing it confirmed were two different things entirely. How, she whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. How did it happen? Matthew leaned forward, his eyes compassionate but steady. They were working a new shaft, pushing deeper into the mountain than was safe. The supports gave way during a shift change. Thomas and the others were trapped too deep for anyone to reach them in time. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It would have been quick, Julie. They would not have suffered. She doubled over, as if struck, her hands pressed to her swollen belly as sobs tore from her throat. All those weeks of waiting, of believing that he would return with gold in his pockets and plans for their future, and he had been dead the entire time. She had been alone, truly alone, for longer than she had even known. Matthew rose from his chair and knelt beside her, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. Let it out, he said quietly. Grief held inside turns poisonous. Better to let it flow like a river than to dam it up until it destroys everything in its path. She cried until she had no tears left, great wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Matthew said nothing, simply stayed beside her with his steady presence, occasionally adding wood to the fire or adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. When the storm of grief finally passed, leaving her feeling hollow but somehow cleaner, she found herself leaning against his solid shoulder. What am I going to do? She asked, her voice small and lost. I have no money, no family, nowhere to go, and the baby will be here soon. You will stay here until the child is born, Matthew said matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After that, we will see what options present themselves. There is no need to make all your decisions tonight. I cannot ask that of you, Julie protested, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a desperate hope that he would insist. You do not even know me. I could be anyone, anything. You are a woman alone and with child, facing winter in the mountains, Matthew replied simply. That is all I need to know. The rest we can figure out as we go. The simple generosity of his offer overwhelmed her. In a world that had shown her little kindness lately, this gruff mountain man was offering her not just shelter, but time and space to heal, to plan, to become something other than a victim of circumstance. Why? She asked, studying his weathered face in the firelight. Why would you do this for a stranger? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if searching for answers in their dancing light. Because once, a long time ago, someone showed kindness to me when I needed it most, he said finally. Because a man who turns his back on those in need becomes something less than human. And because this cabin has been too quiet for too long. The last reason surprised her with its honesty. She had expected noble sentiments about duty and charity, not this simple admission of loneliness. It made him seem more human somehow, this acknowledgement that he too had needs that went beyond mere survival. You must have been very lonely up here all by yourself, she observed gently. Lonely is not the same as alone, Matthew replied. I chose solitude because I thought it was what I needed, but choice and need are not always the same thing. What did you do before you came here? Julie asked, sensing that he was in a mood to share more than usual. I was a soldier, Matthew said simply, fought in the war between the states, saw things that no man should see, did things that no man should do. When it was over, I could not go back to the life I had before. The man who went to war died somewhere in those 4 years, and the man who came back was someone I did not recognize. Julie nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. The war had touched everyone, even those who had never left home. She had seen the haunted look in the eyes of men who returned, the way they jumped at sudden sounds and stared off into distances that others could not see. Is that why you live alone, she asked? Because of what you saw in the war? Partly, Matthew admitted, but also because I learned that I was capable of things I had never imagined. Violence comes easier to some men than others, and I discovered I was one of those men. It seemed safer for everyone if I kept that part of myself away from civilization. The admission should have frightened her, but somehow it did not. There was something in his manner. A careful control that spoke of a man who knew his own darkness and had learned to master it. She had met truly dangerous men before, men who wore their violence like a badge of honor. Matthew was not one of them. You saved my life today, she said quietly. That does not sound like the action of a dangerous man. Perhaps not, Matthew agreed. But a man can be many things at once, Julie. The trick is knowing which part of yourself to listen to in any given moment. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin felt like the safest place in the world. Julie found herself studying Matthew's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to glimpse. Tell me about the baby, Matthew said eventually, nodding toward her rounded belly. When is it due? Soon, Julie replied, placing her hands protectively over the growing life inside her. Perhaps 6 weeks, maybe less. I have been trying not to think about it too much, about what will happen when the time comes. You will need help when the baby arrives, Matthew observed. Do you have any experience with birthing? Some, Julie said, remembering the times she had assisted her mother with neighbors' deliveries back in Missouri. But I had always assumed Thomas would be there, or that we would be near a town with a doctor. There is a woman named Christina Bailey who lives about 20 miles south of here, Matthew said thoughtfully. She has delivered more babies than any doctor I know, and she would come if I asked her. The trails might be difficult in winter, but it can be managed. The relief that washed over her was so intense, it left her dizzy. She had been trying not to think about giving birth alone, about what would happen if something went wrong with no one there to help. The thought of having an experienced woman present made the future seem less terrifying. You think of everything, she said gratefully. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness. There is no debt between us, Matthew replied firmly. We are simply two people helping each other through a difficult time. You need shelter and food, I need company and purpose. It is a fair exchange. But Julie could see through his casual words to the deeper truth beneath. He was offering her far more than she could possibly give in return, and they both knew it. Yet something in his manner suggested that her presence here was indeed valuable to him in ways that had nothing to do with practical considerations. What will people say, she asked suddenly, the thought occurring to her for the first time. About me staying here with you, unmarried and carrying another man's child? Let them say what they will, Matthew replied with a shrug. The nearest neighbors are 20 miles away, and I have never cared much for the opinions of others. Besides, anyone who would judge a woman for seeking shelter in a storm is not worth worrying about. His dismissal of social conventions should have shocked her, but instead she found it liberating. After years of worrying about appearances and propriety, there was something refreshing about being with someone who cared only about practical realities. You are not like other men I have known, she observed. I would hope not, Matthew replied with a slight smile. Most of the men you have known probably had not spent 7 years learning to live by their own rules. As the evening wore on, Julie found herself relaxing in ways she had not thought possible. The warmth of the fire, the solid comfort of the cabin, and Matthew's steady presence combined to create a sense of safety she had almost forgotten existed. When she finally began to nod off in her chair, he helped her to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, which he had clearly prepared for her arrival. This was your room, she protested, taking in the comfortable bed and the clean linens. I sleep better by the fire anyway, Matthew replied easily. Old habits from the war. I like to be able to see the door. As she settled into the soft mattress for the first time in weeks, Julie felt tears prick her eyes again. But these were different from the ones she had shed earlier. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a hope she had thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she was warm and safe, and no longer alone. Through the thin walls, she could hear Matthew moving around the main room, banking the fire and checking the windows against the storm. The sounds were comforting, domestic in a way that reminded her of happier times. She placed her hands on her belly and felt the baby stir, as if it too sensed that they had found sanctuary. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks, deep and dreamless and healing. When she woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon, she felt more like herself than she had since Thomas first left for the mines. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing that the storm had passed and left the world transformed into a pristine wonderland of white. Matthew was already up and dressed, moving efficiently around the small kitchen area as he prepared breakfast. He looked up when she emerged from the bedroom, his eyes taking in her improved color and steadier movements with obvious satisfaction. "You look better," he observed, pouring coffee into a tin cup and handing it to her. "The sleep did you good." "I feel better," Julie admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to fully wake up. "Thank you for everything, Matthew. I know you did not ask for this complication in your life. Complications are what make life interesting," Matthew replied, flipping bacon in the pan with practiced ease. "Besides, it will be good to have someone to cook for besides myself. A man can grow tired of his own company, even if he chooses it." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the snow-covered peaks. The world outside looked clean and new, as if the storm had washed away all the ugliness and left only beauty behind. Julie found herself thinking that if she had to be stranded somewhere, she could hardly have chosen a more beautiful prison. "What do you do up here all winter?" she asked eventually, curious about how he filled the long months of isolation. "Read mostly," Matthew replied, nodding toward the shelves of books. "Hunt when the weather allows. Work on improvements to the cabin. Write letters to old friends, though I seldom send them." "You write," Julie said with interest. "What kind of letters?" "The kind where a man tries to make sense of his life," Matthew admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Mostly they end up in the fire, but the writing helps clarify my thoughts." "I would like to read some of them sometime, if you would not mind sharing," Julie said. "I was a teacher before I married Thomas. I have always loved words, the way they can capture thoughts and feelings that seem too big for ordinary conversation." Matthew looked surprised by her request, but not displeased. "Most people find my thoughts rather dark and uninteresting," he warned. "I doubt that," Julie replied. "A man who lives alone in the mountains and still chooses to help strangers must have interesting thoughts indeed." They spent the morning talking about books and ideas, discovering a shared love of poetry and philosophy that surprised them both. Julie had not expected to find such intellectual companionship in a mountain hermit, while Matthew seemed amazed to meet a woman who could discuss Emerson and Thoreau with genuine understanding. "You should have been a teacher yourself," Julie observed, after Matthew quoted several passages from memory. "You have the mind for it." "I was once," Matthew admitted. "Before the war, I taught at a small college in Ohio. Literature and philosophy, mostly. It seems like another lifetime now." "Why did you give it up?" Julie asked gently. "After the war, I mean." "You could have gone back to teaching." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "The man who went to war was a teacher," he said finally. "The man who came back was something else entirely. I could not stand in front of young minds and pretend to have wisdom worth sharing when I knew what I was capable of in the darkness." "What happened to you over there?" Julie asked softly, sensing that this was the heart of whatever had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains. "I killed men," Matthew said simply. "Not just in battle, though there was plenty of that. But afterward, when the fighting was supposed to be over, there were things that needed doing, ugly things that someone had to handle, and I discovered I was very good at handling them." The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Julie studied his face, seeing the pain that lived behind his careful control, the weight of memories that would never fully fade. "The war made killers of many good men," she said quietly. "That does not mean you stop being good." "Does it not?" Matthew asked, his voice heavy with old doubt. "How does a man measure goodness against the things he has done? How does he know where necessity ends and evil begins?" By what he chooses to do afterward, Julie replied without hesitation. By whether he uses his strength to help or to harm. By whether he builds or destroys. Matthew looked at her with something like wonder, as if she had offered him a perspective he had never considered. "You have a generous heart, Julie Diaz," he said softly. "Perhaps too generous for your own good." "Perhaps," Julie agreed, "but I would rather err on the side of generosity than cynicism. The world has enough darkness without adding to it unnecessarily." They spent the afternoon working together to prepare for the weeks ahead. Matthew showed her his stores of food and supplies, explaining how he managed to remain self-sufficient through the long mountain winters. His preparations were thorough and methodical, the work of a man who understood that survival in such a place required careful planning and constant vigilance. "You have enough here to last through spring," Julie observed, impressed by the quantity of preserved meat, dried vegetables, and other staples he had accumulated. "I learned early that it is better to have too much than too little," Matthew replied, checking the seals on several containers. The mountains do not forgive carelessness or poor planning. As they worked, Julie found herself studying Matthew's movements, noting the economical grace with which he handled even the most mundane tasks. There was something almost military in his precision, a discipline that spoke of years spent in situations where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. "You move like a soldier," she observed, "even now, years after the war." "Some habits never leave you," Matthew admitted. "My commanding officer used to say that the difference between a live soldier and a dead one was attention to detail. I suppose I took that lesson to heart." "What was your rank?" Julie asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. "Captain," Matthew replied. "I led a company of scouts mostly. We were the ones who went ahead of the main force, gathering intelligence and dealing with problems before they became larger problems." "That must have been dangerous work," Julie said, understanding now some of the source of the darkness he carried. "It was necessary work," Matthew corrected gently. "Whether it was dangerous or not seemed less important at the time. We all did what we had to do to survive and to protect the men under our command." As the day wore on, Julie found herself settling into the rhythm of life in the cabin with surprising ease. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple domestic tasks, the sense of contributing to their mutual survival. For the first time since Thomas had left for the mines, she felt useful, needed in ways that went beyond her role as wife and expectant mother. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Matthew surprised her by pulling out a worn leather journal and beginning to write. His pen moved across the page with steady strokes, occasionally pausing as he searched for the right word or phrase. "Is that one of your letters?" Julie asked softly, not wanting to interrupt his concentration. "Something like that," Matthew replied without looking up. "More of a record, I suppose, an attempt to make sense of the day and what it brought." "May I ask what you are writing about today?" Julie ventured. Matthew paused in his writing and looked at her with a slight smile. "About unexpected visitors and the way they can change a man's perspective on solitude," he said. "About the difference between being alone and being lonely, and how sometimes it takes another person to help you understand which one you have been." The words sent a warm flush through Julie's chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her as if her presence mattered, as if she brought something valuable to their life simply by being herself. "I have been thinking about that too," she admitted, "about how strange it is to feel more at home with a stranger than I did in my own house for the last few months." "Perhaps that is because home is not really about places," Matthew suggested, setting down his pen. "Perhaps it is about finding people who see you clearly and accept what they see." The observation struck her as profoundly true. She had spent the last months of her marriage feeling increasingly invisible, as if Thomas's obsession with gold had made him blind to everything else, including her. Here, in this remote cabin with a man she had known for less than 2 days, she felt seen and valued in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. "You see me clearly," she said quietly. "Even though we have just met, you seem to understand things about me that I am only beginning to understand myself." "That is because we recognize something in each other," Matthew replied, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. "We have both been shaped by loss and disappointment, Both learned to survive when survival seemed impossible. That creates a kind of kinship that has nothing to do with time or familiarity. The truth of his words resonated deep in her chest, explaining the strange sense of connection she had felt from the moment he had appeared out of the storm. They were both refugees from lives that had not worked out as planned, both seeking something they could not quite name in the vast wilderness of the mountains. "What are you seeking, Matthew?" she asked impulsively. "What brought you to these mountains beyond just running away from the war?" "Peace, I suppose," Matthew said after a long pause. "The kind of peace that comes from accepting yourself completely, darkness and light together. I thought I could find it in solitude, but perhaps I was wrong about that." "And what did you find instead?" Julie pressed gently. "That peace is not something you find," Matthew replied thoughtfully. "It is something you create, day by day, choice by choice, and that creating it alone is much harder than I thought it would be." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging over topics both profound and mundane. They discovered shared opinions about books and authors, debated questions of philosophy and morality, and gradually began to sketch in the details of their respective pasts. Julie found herself talking about her childhood in Missouri, her dreams of teaching and traveling, the slow erosion of hope that had characterized her marriage to Thomas. "I loved him," she said at one point, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "But I think I love the idea of him more than the reality. He was always chasing something just out of reach, always convinced that the next opportunity would be the one that changed everything." "Some men are born to chase horizons," Matthew observed. "They cannot help themselves, even when it costs them everything they already have." "Were you ever married?" Julie asked, curious about this aspect of his past. "Once," Matthew admitted, "before the war. Her name was Sarah, and she was everything good and pure in the world. She died while I was away fighting, and I think part of me died with her." "I am sorry," Julie said softly, understanding now another layer of the pain he carried. "That must have been devastating." "It was," Matthew agreed. "But perhaps it was also a mercy. The man who came back from the war was not the man she had married. She would not have recognized him, and I am not sure she would have liked what she saw." "Do you think we ever truly know the people we love?" Julie asked, thinking of her own marriage and its ultimate failure. "Or do we just love our own projections and hopes?" "I think we know them as well as they allow themselves to be known," Matthew replied thoughtfully. "The tragedy is that most of us are mysteries even to ourselves. So how can we expect others to understand us completely?" The philosophical discussion gradually gave way to more practical concerns as the night wore on. Matthew explained the routines and rhythms of mountain life, the signs to watch for that indicated changing weather, the skills she would need to contribute to their mutual survival. "Can you shoot?" he asked at one point, nodding toward the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "A little," Julie admitted. "My father taught me the basics, though I have not had much practice since I married Thomas." "We will work on that," Matthew decided. "A woman alone in the mountains needs to be able to protect herself and provide food when necessary. It is a skill that could save your life." The thought of learning to hunt and defend herself was both intimidating and strangely exciting. For so long, she had been dependent on others for her safety and survival. The idea of developing real competence, of becoming someone who could take care of herself and her child, appealed to her in ways she had not expected. "I would like that," she said firmly. "I am tired of being helpless, tired of depending on others for everything I need." "Good," Matthew said with approval. "Helplessness is a choice, not a condition. There is always something you can do to improve your situation, even when the options are limited." As they finally prepared for bed, Julie felt a sense of anticipation she had not experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons. But for the first time since Thomas had left, she felt as if she was moving towards something positive rather than simply enduring whatever came her way. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. Each morning, Matthew would wake early to tend the fire and prepare breakfast, while Julie slowly emerged from the deep, healing sleep that had become possible in the safety of the cabin. They would eat together, discussing their plans for the day, then set about the various tasks that kept them fed, warm, and safe. Matthew proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough in his explanations. He taught her to read the signs that indicated changing weather, to identify edible plants and dangerous animals, to maintain and load the various firearms he kept for protection and hunting. Julie absorbed these lessons eagerly, feeling herself grow stronger and more confident with each passing day. "You are a natural student," Matthew observed one afternoon as she successfully hit a target he had set up behind the cabin. "You learn quickly and remember what you are taught." "I had forgotten how much I enjoyed learning new things," Julie replied, lowering the rifle with satisfaction. "Teaching others was always fulfilling, but there is something special about acquiring new skills yourself." "What did you teach?" Matthew asked, genuinely curious about her former life. "Everything, really," Julie said with a laugh. "In a small-town school, you teach whatever needs teaching. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. I even taught some music and art when the regular teacher was unavailable." "You must miss it," Matthew observed. "The sense of purpose, the connection with young minds." "I do," Julie admitted, "but I am beginning to think that teaching takes many forms. What you are doing with me, helping me develop skills and confidence, that is teaching too. Perhaps more important than anything I ever did in a classroom." As her pregnancy advanced, Matthew's care became even more attentive without ever becoming intrusive or overwhelming. He seemed to sense instinctively when she needed help and when she needed to maintain her independence. The balance he struck between protection and respect impressed her daily. One morning, as she struggled to reach something on a high shelf, Matthew appeared beside her and lifted it down without comment or fanfare. Another day, when she insisted on helping with the heavier chores despite his gentle protests, he found ways to modify the task so she could contribute without overtaxing herself. "You are going to make someone a wonderful husband someday," Julie observed one evening as he helped her with her boots, which had become impossible for her to manage alone. Matthew paused in his task, his hands stilling on the leather laces. "I had not thought much about marriage since Sarah died," he admitted. "It seemed like something that belonged to a different man, a different life." "People change," Julie said gently. "The man you are now is not the same as the man who went to war, but he is not necessarily a worse man, just different." "Do you think so?" Matthew asked, his eyes searching her face as if looking for confirmation of something he desperately wanted to believe. "I know so," Julie replied without hesitation. "The man who went to war might not have stopped to help a stranger in a storm. The man you are now did not hesitate. The observation seemed to affect him deeply. He finished helping with her boots in thoughtful silence, then spent the evening writing in his journal with unusual intensity." Julie did not ask what he was recording, but she hoped it had something to do with the gradual healing she sensed taking place in his spirit. As winter deepened and her pregnancy progressed, their conversations grew more intimate and wide-ranging. They talked about their fears and hopes, their regrets and dreams. Julie found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she had never been able to express to Thomas, while Matthew gradually opened up about the experiences that had shaped him. One night, as they sat by the fire listening to the wind howl through the peaks, Matthew surprised her by asking about her plans for after the baby was born. "I have been trying not to think too far ahead," Julie admitted. "The immediate challenges seem overwhelming enough without worrying about what comes next." "But you must have some idea of what you want," Matthew pressed gently. "Some vision of the life you hope to build for yourself and your child." Julie was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as she tried to articulate dreams she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge. "I want to be useful again," she said finally. "I want to contribute something meaningful to the world, to raise my child to be strong and kind and capable. Beyond that, I suppose I want to find someone who sees me clearly and values what they see." The last part of her answer seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Matthew's eyes met hers across the firelight, and she saw something in them that made her heart beat faster. "And you," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want for your future?" "I want to stop running from the past," Matthew replied quietly. "I want to believe that a man can be more than the worst thing he has ever done. And I want to find someone who can see all of me, darkness and light together, and choose to stay anyway." The words created a tension between them that was both thrilling and terrifying. Julie felt as if they were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into depths that could either destroy them or transform them completely. Matthew, she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing that something needed to be acknowledged. I know, Matthew said softly, understanding her unspoken thoughts. I feel it too, Julie. But you are vulnerable right now, grieving and displaced and carrying another man's child. I will not take advantage of that, no matter what I might feel. His consideration for her well-being, even at the cost of his own desires, only deepened her growing feelings for him. Here was a man who put her needs before his own, who saw her as more than just an object of desire or a solution to his loneliness. What if I were not vulnerable, she asked quietly. What if I were free to choose based on what I wanted rather than what I needed? Then I would court you properly, Matthew replied without hesitation. I would try to convince you that a damaged man could still be worthy of a good woman's love. You are not as damaged as you think, Julie said firmly, and I am not as good as you seem to believe. We are both just people trying to find our way through difficult circumstances. Perhaps that is enough, Matthew said, hope creeping into his voice for the first time. Perhaps that is more than enough. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. While they maintained the same respectful boundaries as before, there was now an acknowledgement of deeper feelings that colored every interaction. Julie found herself noticing small details about Matthew that she had overlooked before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle competence of his hands as he worked, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him even in moments of rest. For his part, Matthew seemed to watch her with new intensity, as if he were memorizing every expression and gesture. His care for her became even more thoughtful, if such a thing were possible. He anticipated her needs before she voiced them, created small comforts and conveniences that made her daily life easier. One morning, she woke to find that he had built a special chair for her, designed to support her back and accommodate her growing belly. The craftsmanship was beautiful, every joint perfectly fitted and sanded smooth as silk. When did you have time to make this? She asked in wonder, running her hands over the polished wood. I have been working on it in the evenings, Matthew replied, looking pleased by her obvious delight. After you go to bed, I thought you might be more comfortable with something designed specifically for your needs. The chair became her favorite spot in the cabin, the place where she sat to read or sew, or simply watch Matthew as he went about his daily tasks. From there, she could observe the quiet efficiency with which he managed their life together, the way he seemed to find satisfaction in even the most mundane chores when they contributed to her comfort and well-being. You enjoy taking care of people, she observed one afternoon as he returned from checking the snares he had set for small game. I had forgotten that about myself, Matthew admitted, hanging his coat by the door. During the war and for years afterward, I thought of myself only as someone who destroyed things. It is good to remember that I can also build and nurture and protect. The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if responding to their conversation. Julie gasped and pressed her hand to her side, feeling the strong movement beneath her palm. Is everything all right? Matthew asked immediately, crossing to her side with concern written across his features. More than all right, Julie said with a laugh, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. The baby is just very active today. Feel that? Matthew's eyes widened in wonder as he felt the child moving beneath his palm. His expression grew soft and amazed, as if he were witnessing a miracle. How strong, he murmured, his voice filled with awe. How alive. Sometimes I think the baby knows we are safe now, Julie said softly. The movements have become much more vigorous since we arrived here. Children sense more than we give them credit for. Matthew agreed, his hand still resting gently on her belly. This one will be born into love and safety, whatever else the future holds. The simple statement brought tears to Julie's eyes. For so long, she had been terrified about bringing a child into a world that seemed hostile and uncertain. Now, surrounded by Matthew's strength and care, she could begin to imagine a future filled with possibility rather than just survival. Thank you, she whispered, covering his hand with both of hers, for everything you have given us. You have given me far more than I have given you, Matthew replied seriously. You have reminded me what it feels like to have purpose beyond mere survival. You have shown me that I am capable of gentleness as well as violence." As the days passed, their bond continued to deepen in ways that went beyond words or physical attraction. They developed the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared experience and mutual understanding. A glance across the room could convey volumes. A gesture could offer comfort or support without explanation. Julie began to help Matthew with his evening writing, sometimes offering suggestions for word choice or phrasing, other times simply listening as he read passages aloud. His writing was indeed dark at times, but it was also beautiful and profound, filled with insights that could only come from someone who had experienced both the worst and best of human nature. "You should publish some of these," she told him one evening after he had shared a particularly moving piece about redemption and second chances. "Who would want to read the thoughts of a hermit mountain man?" Matthew asked with self-deprecating humor. "Anyone who has ever struggled with their own darkness," Julie replied firmly. "Anyone who has wondered whether they can change or grow or become something better than they were. That includes most of humanity, I think." The idea seemed to intrigue him, and over the following days he began to organize his writings with more purpose, as if considering the possibility that they might have value beyond personal catharsis. Julie helped him sort through years of accumulated pages, identifying the strongest pieces and suggesting ways they might be arranged into a coherent collection. Working together on the project brought them even closer, creating a shared, creative endeavor that felt deeply intimate. They would spend hours discussing themes and meanings, debating the merits of different approaches, losing themselves in the world of ideas and expression. "You have a gift for this," Julie told him, as they worked on revising a particularly complex piece about the nature of forgiveness. "Your insights could help others who are struggling with similar questions." "Perhaps," Matthew said thoughtfully, "but I think the real gift has been having someone to share the work with. Writing in isolation is one thing, but having a thoughtful reader and collaborator changes everything." As her due date approached, Matthew sent word to Christina Bailey, the midwife he had mentioned weeks earlier. Despite the difficulty of winter travel, Christina arrived at the cabin 3 days before Julie went into labor, bringing with her years of experience and a calm competence that immediately put Julie at ease. "You have been well cared for," Christina observed after examining Julie. "The baby is in perfect position, and you are strong and healthy. This should be a straightforward delivery." "Matthew has taken excellent care of us both," Julie agreed, smiling at the man who had become so much more than just her rescuer. "He is a good man," Christina said simply. "I have known him for several years, and I have seen how he treats those who need help. You are fortunate to have found each other." The labor began on a clear, cold morning when the mountains were painted pink and gold by the rising sun. Matthew paced the main room of the cabin like a caged wolf, while Christina and Julie worked through the contractions with calm determination. "This is the hardest part for the men," Christina told Julie during a brief respite. "They want to help, but there is nothing they can do except wait and worry." "He has been so strong for me through everything," Julie said, thinking of all the ways Matthew had supported her over the past months. "I hate that he has to suffer now when I cannot spare him the worry." "That is what love looks like," Christina replied matter-of-factly, sharing both the joy and the pain, the triumph and the fear. The word love hung in the air like a benediction. Julie had not spoken it aloud, had barely allowed herself to think it, but hearing it from Christina's lips made it real in a way that could no longer be denied. When the baby finally arrived, after hours of intense labor, it was Matthew who Julie called for first. He entered the room with wonder and terror warring in his face, approaching the bed as if he were witnessing something sacred. "A daughter," Christina announced, placing the cleaned and swaddled infant in Julie's arms. Perfect in every way. Julie looked down at her daughter's tiny face, feeling a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. The baby's eyes were dark and alert, already seeming to take in the world with curious intelligence. "She is beautiful," Matthew said softly, reaching out to touch the infant's tiny fist with one gentle finger. "Absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold her?" Julie asked, seeing the longing in his eyes. Matthew's hands shook slightly as he accepted the precious bundle, but his touch was sure and gentle. The baby settled immediately against his chest, as if recognizing safety and love in his embrace. "Hello, little one," Matthew whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Watching him with her daughter, Julie felt her heart overflow with a happiness she had never thought possible. This man who had saved her life, who had given her shelter and safety and love, was now cradling her child with the same tender care he had shown her. "What will you name her?" Christina asked, beginning to clean up after the delivery. Julie looked at Matthew, seeing in his face the same overwhelming love she felt in her own heart. She had been thinking about names for weeks, but now, seeing him hold her daughter with such reverence, only one name seemed right. "Hope," she said firmly. "Her name is Hope." "It is perfect," Matthew agreed, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. "Hope for all of us, for the future we will build together." In the days that followed, as Julie recovered from the birth and they all adjusted to the presence of the newest member of their little family, the bonds between them grew even stronger. Matthew proved to be a natural with the baby, taking on night feedings and diaper changes with the same competent care he brought to everything else. "You do not have to do so much," Julie protested one morning as she found him walking the floor with a fussy Hope while she slept. "I want to do it," Matthew replied simply. "She is as much my responsibility as yours now. We are a family, Julie, in every way that matters." The word family sent warmth flooding through her chest. It was what she had been hoping for without daring to name it. The sense of belonging and mutual commitment that made them more than just three individuals sharing a space. As spring began to show its first tentative signs in the mountains, melting snow revealing patches of brown earth and the promise of new growth, Julie knew that their time of isolation was drawing to a close. Soon the trails would be passable again, and decisions would have to be made about their future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, with Hope sleeping peacefully in Julie's arms, Matthew cleared his throat and looked at her with unusual nervousness. "Julie," he began, then stopped and started again. "I know we have never spoken formally about our feelings, about what we mean to each other. But I need you to know that these months with you and Hope have been the happiest of my life." "They have been the happiest of mine too," Julie replied softly, seeing where this conversation was leading and feeling her heart begin to race with anticipation. "I love you," Matthew said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love your strength and your kindness, your intelligence and your courage. I love the way you see the best in people, even when they cannot see it in themselves. And I love Hope as if she were my own daughter." "I love you too," Julie whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love your gentleness and your protection, your wisdom and your humor. I love the way you have made us feel safe and valued and cherished." "Then marry me," Matthew said, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Not because you need my protection or I need your companionship, but because we choose each other freely and completely. Marry me because we have built something beautiful together, and we want to keep building it for the rest of our lives." "Yes," Julie said without hesitation, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Matthew Jones. I will marry you with joy and gratitude and love." As he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had somehow managed to acquire during one of his trips to town for supplies, Julie felt the last pieces of her broken life clicking into place. She had lost so much, had endured pain and fear and desperation that had nearly destroyed her. But from that destruction had come something new and precious, a love deeper and truer than anything she had known before. The mountain man who had found her starving and desperate in the snow had given her far more than shelter and safety. He had given her a new life, a new identity, a new understanding of what love could be when it was built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. "Get on my horse now," he had said that first day, and she had trusted him enough to obey. Now, as they planned their wedding and their future together, she knew that following him had been the best decision of her life. He had not just saved her from the storm that day. He had saved her from a life of mere survival and given her one of genuine happiness and purpose. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the peaks, but inside their cabin, three hearts beat in harmony, creating a warmth that no storm could ever extinguish. They were a family now, bound not by necessity or convenience, but by the strongest force in the universe, love freely given and gratefully received.